Morning, Mr. Miller.
Mr.
Yeah, we
General.
here.
Okay, we're ready for you.
All right, thank
You
you.
have your president.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us or giving us the opportunity to come and speak with you commissioners today about the presentation. Is called the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. And let me introduce myself and my colleague first and kind of give you a little brief background of who we are. My name is Paul Miller, and I'm the Director of Policy Outreach for the Center on Budget Policy. Now, that's a research organization located in Charleston. I live in Parkersburg. My colleague lives in Milton, but he's still on the board, and I'm the Director of Policy Outreach. And what we do, or what the Center does, it's a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan. And what they do is they do research and analysis based upon economic data, census data, factual-based data. And what we do is we use that data to drive the policy discussion, particularly tax and budget policy issues. And my focus really is on economic development. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is to talk to you briefly about an economic development policy proposal that's being discussed in Charleston. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. It's also known as the Future Fund. That was in the last legislative session, Senate President Jeff Kessler, Marshall County, had introduced a bill, Senate Bill 182. And in that bill, he laid out an idea that said, you know, we're going to have increases in the severance tax collections related to the Marcellus Shale development. And what their proposal is, their policy proposal is simply to take a portion, specifically 25%, 1/4, of the additional monies that come in based on volume and production. They're not changing the rate, the severance tax rate, just the additional monies that are coming in. They want to set a portion of that aside into a permanent mineral trust fund. Permanent because they don't want the legislature or anybody else to rate it. It should be inviolate. So it would be for the benefit of our children and our grandchildren. And the idea is very simple. Take this additional severance tax collection, let's set it aside for a period of 20 years. And after 20 years, start taking the interest income off that principal balance and start using that for economic development projects like roads and bridges and education and workforce development, things that we need. We need roads, sewers, bridges, broadband. As we travel, as the outreach director, I've traveled all over the state. I've talked to county commissioners about this policy proposal. I've talked to local and regional economic development authorities about this proposal because this is an important local economic development issue because the monies would be ideally for use for local economic development projects. And so the first reason I'm here is just to let you know that this policy is being discussed, and whether you were familiar with it or not, we think you should be because it is important to Voucher County. The second reason is because we want you to be part of that discussion, so you can work with your delegates, work with your senators, and talk to them about how is this going to affect our county, particularly. And so those two reasons are the reasons why we do outreach and education. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization. We have no fiduciary interest in investments or anything like that. We won't be there when that discussion takes place. Our goal is simply to raise the consciousness and put it on the agenda for local and regional economic development officials so you become aware of it. And so hopefully you can become a participant in that policy discussion. You can communicate with Charleston and let them know, what is going on with this policy and how will it affect our county. One reason I mentioned is that they introduced the bill last session, although it didn't pass, the legislature has decided to take it up during the legislative interim process as a study. So they decided this is a topic worth studying. So what that suggests is, again, it's gaining momentum. Now, what will probably happen is after the legislative interim process is over, leading into the next full legislative session, they'll probably introduce another bill. And again, that's another opportunity for local economic development officials to be involved in that policy discussion. Now, what I presented to you today is what you have in front of you, Commissioners, is a PowerPoint presentation where it's basically laid out in 3 chapters. And the first chapter is basically just an overview of the demographic and the economic data that's confronting West Virginia and the counties. And what you're going to see is, you're going to see in that data, you're going to see a state of West Virginia that has historically, our fortunes have been tied to mineral resource extraction industries, coal, oil, gas, and timber. And what happens is, you see that when times are good, when production's up or the price is up for coal or gas, things are good in West Virginia. We have surpluses. We have revenue surpluses, and that's great. But the downside is that when the production declines, or the price in the market for coal declines, or gas declines, you're going to have downturns in the economy. And so you get this sort of boom and you get this bust, historically in West Virginia. And I've laid that out in a graph in that PowerPoint where you see the booms and the busts. What I mean by booms is when times are good, money comes in, employment goes up, population increases, per capita income goes up. And when the bottom falls out of the market in coal, oil, gas, you see downturns in employment. You see population declines. You see declines in per capita personal income. Again, all that's suggesting is that West Virginia is not a very diverse economy. We have historically been associated with mineral resources. And as long as mineral resource extraction continues, that would be great. But the reality is, mineral resource extraction is finite. They're very limited. Once you extract it out of the ground, you get the economic benefit of the extraction and the short-term economic gain from transporting it and such. But once it's gone, physically, once that coal is gone, that oil is gone, that gas is gone, there's nothing to replace it with. So as a budget analyst or an economist, what we try to do is look and say, okay, well, how can we sort of look beyond coal, future coal, look beyond what happens when coal production declines? As the EIA estimates suggest that in West Virginia, coal production is going to decline by 36% for the entire state. Southern West Virginia, it's going to be much worse. It's going to be closer to 2/3 of that decline in production. So what happens to these communities? What happens to the counties that when they're relying on severance tax collections? When the bottom falls out, you're going to be scrambling for severance tax collections. And so what you're experiencing right now, and what West Virginia is experiencing right now, and I've seen it as I walk into Portland, and I've seen it throughout the northern panhandle. We've been north, we've been south, we've been all over the state. We see abstractors, we see people working, we see permits being issued, we see leases being arranged. And that suggests that West Virginia is experiencing another boom in natural resources. We anticipate that. And so the state is anticipating the Marcellus boom as well. And so this policy proposal is very simple. It says, okay, we have another chance to turn the clock back. We didn't do it with coal. We didn't take advantage of it when we had coal. Okay, we didn't think about it when we had coal. We just took the jobs as they came, and when it's gone, it's gone. If you haven't been to Wyoming County or McDowell County recently, you'll understand what I'm talking about. An economy that's completely associated with one industry, as long as that industry is thriving, you're okay, but if it falls out, you're decimated. And that's what we fear would happen for West Virginia. So what we want to do is we want to not repeat the mistakes of the last 100 years. We want to say, okay, we're at the crossroads of this Marcellus boom. How can we take advantage of this opportunity that we see from West Virginia? How can we take advantage of this opportunity and say, let's not repeat the mistakes of the past? So the idea is very simple. You take a finite resource like minerals, and you convert it to a sustainable, permanent source of wealth. The only way to do that is through the creation of a trust fund. Now, this policy proposal isn't unique. There are other states out west who are like West Virginia, mineral resource extraction states, have already done this. Alaska instituted their permanent trust fund in '76. Now, I have a list of the various states that have a mineral trust fund that is similarly being proposed in Charleston. So what we're suggesting is that if West Virginia were to adopt a future fund, a fund that would allow this excess revenue to be set aside for future economic development purposes, set aside for our future children and our grandchildren, so they can stay and have opportunities to stay, jobs. This is our opportunity. This is our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're not going to see this happening again. And so that's why we think this proposal is good for West Virginia, and we would encourage you to become familiar with the issue, learn about the policy issue, talk with your delegates, talk with your senators, find out how it's going to affect Doddridge County. And most importantly, if you consider it to be a good public policy issue, What we're asking is that you endorse a resolution that we submitted to other county commissioners across the state. That resolution simply says we think this is essentially a good idea, setting some money aside for our future children and grandchildren for economic purpose. I have with me my colleague from Milton. His name is Rick Wilson. He actually is a board member for the Center on Budget Policy. And I would give him just some deference, if you wouldn't mind, just give him a couple minutes to introduce himself and maybe a little bit about the trust fund as well. Right?
Thank you. Again, it's a very simple idea. It's how do we take one-time resources that are not renewable and make a permanent source of wealth for West Virginia. And again, always think about what would have happened had we thought of this 100 years ago. What would the counties look like in the energy counties? As Paul said, we've been all over the state, especially in energy counties. I was in McDowell County earlier this week. Doddridge, I believe, is the county with the highest gas production. McDowell is one of the counties from which most of the coal has been extracted. McDowell and Logan, the two big ones. I don't know if you've been there, but it's a pretty sad place. A lot of boarded up windows. The mayor of one town of Gore was just murdered because of prescription drugs in the family. There's a lot of despair there, and it just shows that often from the places where a lot of natural wealth goes, not a lot gets put back. And so the basic idea is let's change the game a little bit. Let's put it back and make sure we have a permanent source of doing that. As Paul mentioned, many states do it. The one that most people think about probably is Alaska. They have a huge trust fund. They started it in the 70s. It's got $40 billion in it.
40 billion.
10 times our state general fund budget. In Alaska, everybody gets a check, and they also use it to pay for basic state services. We're not going to be in that league in any meaningful time, but still, we could do projects that could help promote economic development and transition. Again, we think it's a good idea for West Virginia. We could do the 21st century a little bit better than we did the 20th. That makes sense. So.
Thank you, Rick. So again, just in summary, you know, we're economists. We're budget policy wonks. What we do is we look at data, and you see the data. You see West Virginia has not historically benefited from the wealth of natural resources that we've had. I mean, arguably, West Virginia should be the richest state in the nation based upon our extraction of our coal and our oil and gas that come out of the state. But yet, if you look at the data, West Virginia ranks 49th and 50th in all major indicators of wealth, prosperity, and well-being. It suggests that while we've had the resources, our citizens have not benefited. And that's as a budget analyst, policy analyst, that's what we try to do. We try to identify policies that will help, you know, West Virginia families, moderate and low-income families. Moderate and low-income families need jobs and need opportunities for education. So I'll leave it there and answer questions that you may have about the trust fund. And again, I have a resolution, and I would encourage you to, again, review the material, talk to your delegates, talk to your senators, and at a later commission meeting, you know, if you're, you know, endorse the resolution. Our goal is to collect all the resolutions that are being endorsed by the county commissioners and the local and regional economic development officials. We're going to put them together, and we're going to present that to the state legislature when they introduce the legislation that we think is a good policy. Again, I would acquiesce at this point and answer any questions that you have about the future fund.
Beth has some questions.
Sure.
Just the percentage of the oil and gas severance and the coal severance, is that going to be a new tax, or is it to take part of what's already existing?
It's a good question. I mentioned earlier, it's not going to change the tax base at all. So the severance tax rate will not change. All it's doing is taking additional revenues over and beyond what the state has already collected. So for example, right now, the state of West Virginia collects about $65 million in gas severance tax collection, and they distribute that to the state. You get your portion, right? Well, what this bill would do is say, okay, any money's over and beyond that baseline, the threshold, that's 65 million, over and beyond that, they would take 1/4 of the additional revenue, the incremental revenue that comes to the state as a result of increased production and increased volume that they receive going on there. So we would not take away the existing revenue that you currently are getting.
I was wondering if it would take what we get now.
No, it would not go beyond the base. Would be additional revenues beyond the base.
How much above, when you look at what you're taking, the amount above, what percentage of that amount that is above? The entire amount, or what percentage of that amount?
It would be 25% of additional revenues beyond the baseline, 1/4. And it would last, again, they would set that aside for a period of 20 years.
And invest it the same way they do state investment funds.
So
now.
the State Investment Management Board, Craig Slaughter and his folks, according to the latest incarnation of the bill, they would empower him to make the investment decision that he's currently doing for state investments. And yes, ma'am.
Who sets the basic fee that they normally would get? In other words, can that be changed from year to year, your base fee?
Well, right now, the way the Senate Bill 182 is written is that it would not affect what the current revenues that you're currently receiving as of the previous fiscal year. So again, that's $65 million. So what it's saying is that you're guaranteed, what you're currently already getting, you're going to get that, and you're going to get additional revenues over and beyond that, whatever sales tax comes in. But they're just going to take 1/4 of the additional, set it aside, not allow you to spend it.
Okay, who's going to dole it out in 20 years from now? And who's going to guarantee that it's still going to be there in 20 years?
Well, again, those are very good questions, and I would say two things. One, a lot of the details haven't been fleshed out. Okay, the language in that bill is very broad, and that leads me to my second point. This is the reason why we're here. We need local and regional economic development officials to be involved in that policy discussion, to inform Charleston as to what's important for local economic development. So as the bill gets shaped and caressed, this is why we think you can play a critical role, Madam President. You guys can play a critical role to get this bill to help local and regional economic development officials.
One part of
The
your
administration of this proposed fund, will it be government? Are you proposing to be government, private, or quasi-government?
Well, right now, it would be set up the West Virginia Investment Management Board, which is Craig Slaughter. They're a quasi-public entity. They're responsible for managing the state investments. They do stocks, bonds.
It would go to an existing organization?
Yes, they're not creating a new organization, not creating another administrative arm of government. They would use the existing infrastructure. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just thinking.
You had one question, how do you know it would still be there? Well, the law, if it gets passed, we're not going to be in the room when these deals are made. Obviously, we're very small on a big scale, but the law would need to state that you can't raise the principal if the principal is involved, and what you pay out as the interest.
Look at the retirement system and the insurance of the retirement system. Okay, it was rated. Now they're questioning the retirement plan, the funds permit. Who's to guarantee that Doddridge County, who has the highest, who could take that 1/4 and put it back in their own little nest egg and have control of it in Doddridge County to say what happens to it? That it could still be sitting there instead of putting it into a big pile and maybe not getting any of it back.
Well, again, this is why we think, if you were communicating with Charleston through your elected policy officials, you guys can help make sure that Doddridge County benefits significantly from Marcellus development. And I would add one thing. Last year during the legislative session, Senator Stallings from Boone County introduced legislation and did pass. And that legislation dealt with coal severance tax. And what he did, because he's from Boone County, and half of their employment comes from coal, they're largely responsible for the current coal tax. What he did is he made sure that additional severance tax collections that are related to coal came back to the counties that were largely responsible for extracting coal. We think that's a good idea. We also think it would be a great idea for Marcellus Shale development as well. So if you're largely responsible for a lot of the extraction of the Marcellus Shale development, well, I can't see why you wouldn't be able to make that case, similarly to Senator Stallings did, that you should be compensated appropriately for that. Because you guys are the ones that are dealing with the infrastructure problems and the costs associated with extraction. You got to repair the roads and the bridges, the vehicles that are consuming the resources. So it makes sense. And they did it for coal. I can't see why they wouldn't do it for natural gas.
ask you another question? Have you done an illustration on some conceptual base case that's in that PowerPoint presentation? It takes, let's say, $100 and, takes it out over the 20 years and, per year, and that would take off the administrative fees and some assumption about what your return on your investment would be?
We have, that's the thing, that's a very,
Could I have a copy of that, please?
yeah, that's a very good question. We have in fact calculated what the estimated value of a trust fund would be. We did, let's see, based on current average investment return rates from the West Virginia Investment Management Board, you can see that potential growth in the trust fund. By 2035, we have $3.1 billion set aside in principal, and we would have already spent about 1.3 billion in interest income. So it gives you kind of a perspective based on a 7.5% return where we think the state could actually achieve it.
Excuse me, do you not think that 7.5% return is a little high?
Well,
that's the average.
That is the average for the last 10 years for investment management. I know the last couple of years we've had a hit, we've all taken hits, but you've got to kind of look at the long-term rate of return. The last 10 years, it's averaged from 6.
Different scenarios, different assumptions as regards your rate of return.
The only thing in that is based on 7.5%.
And the other thing to think about in drafting a bill like this, there are a lot of ways it could be done. Obviously, Senator Kessler's bill is probably the simplest. Some places say, should we should portion coal savings taxes in it? Well, there are a lot of ways you could do it. And again, we're not going to be in the room when that discussion happens. So, but probably the simplest way to look at it is just the Kessler bill, which will take a portion of the increase. Obviously, the more you put in, the more you take out. You'll joke about the collection rate.
Well, I submit that the illustration, while based on history, everything that I understand is that we are very likely not going to see 7.5% over another 20-year period. That is quite optimistic. And that these numbers are going to change rather significantly depending on what that assumption is.
Well,
And does this include your administrative fees?
Those
The
are
cost of the, is this net of expenses?
yeah. These are actually the actual revenues that we estimate that the state would
Those are
actually
the revenues,
generate.
these are net revenues.
Yes, that would be
Okay.
after the administrative expenses.
Okay. Thank you.
But
That's my comment.
well, you can have that. I can submit another one for you. I think the important point here is that if we don't set aside money, I mean, arguably the state's going to use it for whatever, and we're not going to have investment opportunities in the future. We're not going to, because the reality is why, we're going to run out of coal. We're going to run out of gas. We need to start thinking about what happens when we live in a post-natural resource economy, and what happens to West Virginia. So if we're not thinking in the future about planning and preparing and diversifying our economy, we're going to be susceptible to the risks of the boom and bust cycles of the natural resource economy. And I don't think the history has shown that has not been great for West Virginia. So while you're absolutely right that that's one assumption based on one set of variables, I could calculate 500 different assumptions, rate of returns, and basing 500 different variables. But I think the important point is that even if it's 4%, even if it's 3%, even if it's 2%, it'd be better to set it aside like a savings account for the future. Even if you get 2% or 3%, it'd be better to have that money for when the actual resources decline and you have nothing left to look toward to create wealth. I think that's the kind of thing you need to think about is how do we plan for the next 20 years?
I would suggest, because I've done a lot of these, okay, that in order to enhance your presentation, that you take a range number, 2%, and show that to 7.5%, to illustrate that you're aware of the fact if there are highs you know, that there are some possibilities based on current situation, which is not very sanguine, you know, out so many years. But if you were to be sanguine and say it was 7.5%, you understand what I'm saying? And then also what I hear is that Marcellus Shale is going to produce forever and forever. So you might want to also count your presentation in terms of when it is likely. What are the expectations for when we're going to start running out of the Marcellus Shale production capacity?
6 to
I think
10.
that, as a decision maker, and I've made lots of them in my life, those kind of things, not only as a presenter I would want to present, but as a decision maker I would want to hear.
Those are very valid points. I appreciate that insight. I think it's really key insight on both those points. You know, one of the things that you're going to find out is, and you're probably already experiencing, is that, you know, the natural resource market is very volatile. And even if you have gas in the ground, there's no guarantee that they're going to extract it. Or even if they extract it, it can be storing until prices increase. So, I mean, the reality is that even if you had the natural resource, you're still subject to the fluctuations of the price of the markets. I mean, production issues aside, price is very important. Okay? And think about other industries, like, you know, what happened in Ravenswood with the aluminum, you know, pricing. You know, they could still produce aluminum, but it wasn't profitable for producers because the cheap, you know, international Russian, Chinese aluminum just decimated the aluminum market, laid off 650 workers in Ravenswood. You know, it had nothing to do with production; it had everything to do with price. So again, production is one issue, but price is another issue. And so, you know, you got to think about, well, even if you had it in the ground, there's still a good chance that you would not benefit from it. Because they're not going to extract it.
There would still be things that would probably need to be cleaned up that are associated with the ongoing activity, where some might be useful as well.
But you're absolutely right, ma'am. Those are very astute questions, thinking about different scenarios. That's a good point.
Just a couple.
And the other issue is that, you know, what happens if, you know, we continue? I would love, in fact, I would love to think that West Virginia had an infinite supply of gas and oil and coal, but we're not experiencing that. You know, we understand that coal is depleting and we're not going to get that benefit back. Are there any other questions, Commissioner? Any questions? Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you. And again, if you would kindly consider the proposal to endorse the resolution, I'd be glad to come back. As I said, I live in Parksburg, so it's not inconvenient for me. I'd be glad to come back at another future commission meeting and answer any more questions. If you have more questions, please